The Last Stand of Yarrick. The harsh sun beat down on the barren wasteland of Droska 4, a planet that no one in the galaxy had any reason to remember. Covered in dust storms, craggy canyons, and thorny scrublands, the planet had been abandoned decades ago, its resources stripped clean by the infamous Xizor raiders. No one came here anymore, not the trade ships, not the diplomats, and certainly not the settlers. No one, that is, except Yarrick. Yarrick wasn't a soldier. He was a survivor, and there was a big difference between the two. The galaxy had never cared about this desolate world, but Yarrick? He cared. He had lived through the destruction of his homeworld, Varus 3, a lush and thriving planet that had been burned to the ground by the Xizor raiders. His family, his friends, his entire life had been wiped out in a single, horrifying night. He had been one of the few lucky enough to escape in the chaos that followed. And when the galaxy turned its back on him, when no one else cared to fight back, Yarrick made it his mission to confront the raiders alone, if need be. For months, Yarrick had tracked the raiders, learning their tactics, anticipating their movements, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And today, that opportunity had come. From his perch atop a jagged cliff, Yarrick watched as the raider fleet descended from the atmosphere, their enormous warships casting shadows across the surface of the planet. The Xizor were notorious for their brutality and their thirst for destruction. These pirates weren't just raiders, they were the galaxy's worst scourge, known for obliterating entire colonies for sport. And today, they were about to face their worst nightmare, a Deathworlder who knew no fear. Yarrick's fingers gripped the heavy blaster rifle slung across his back, and he took one last look at the planet's desolate landscape. "Time to make my stand," he muttered to himself. He had no reinforcements, no backup, no plan beyond survival and retribution. But Yarrick wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The Xizor were coming, and he was ready. Chapter 2: The Raiders Arrive. The raider ships landed with the precision of a seasoned predator closing in on its prey. Their designs were sleek, almost organic, like a monstrous fusion of a spacefaring predator and an ancient warship. The Xizor did not care about subtlety or finesse. They came in, raided, killed, and left, leaving only destruction behind them. For them, this was a job, not a conquest. Yarrick didn't need to wait long. The raiders disembarked in full force, armored and armed to the teeth, moving in military formation as they deployed into the wasteland. They were here for something valuable. Yarrick didn't know exactly what, but he didn't care. They were his enemies, and that was all he needed to know. He moved quickly, staying low, his steps silent as he navigated the rocky terrain. Yarrick had always been a master of stealth, honed through years of surviving on Varus 3's unforgiving landscapes. The raiders thought they were hunting for easy prey, but in truth, they were the ones being hunted. His first target appeared, a lone raider scout, a muscular humanoid with silver-plated armor and a helmet designed to strike terror into anyone who saw it. Yarrick didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out from his position, and the raider dropped to the ground without so much as a grunt, his body crumpling into the dust. One down. But it wasn't enough. Yarrick needed to draw the raiders' attention. He needed them to come for him. He wanted them to know the cost of underestimating a Deathworlder. The next few hours passed in a blur of calculated violence. Yarrick took out more raiders, using their own tactics against them, setting traps, planting explosives, and picking them off one by one. His attacks were fast, deadly, and efficient. Every shot was precise. Every movement deliberate. He knew how to make an impact and disappear before they even realized what hit them. And yet, as the bodies of the raiders began to pile up, the one thing he hadn't expected began to happen. The raiders were starting to panic. Chapter 3: The Arrival of the Xizor War Leader. By the time Yarrick had taken out the first wave of raiders, something had changed in the air. The dust storms had begun to swirl faster, and the tension had thickened, like the calm before the storm. He could sense that something bigger was coming. His instincts were proven right when the ground shook beneath him. A massive shadow loomed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable hum of a hovercraft. The Xizor war leader had arrived. A towering figure stepped out of the ship, draped in the royal, battle-worn armor of the Xizor leadership. His presence alone exuded power and control. The war leader was a legend, a ruthless tactician who had torn through civilizations with the efficiency of a surgeon. His name was Torgar, and the galaxy trembled when he arrived. The raiders did not flee from Torgar, they feared him. And now, it was Jarek's turn to face this living nightmare. Torgar surveyed the battlefield, his golden eyes scanning the wreckage of his soldiers. His lips curled into a snarl. Who dares challenge the might of the Xizor? He roared, his voice a low, guttural growl. Jarek felt his pulse quicken, but he remained still. The war leader had already figured out that there was a human out here, a single warrior who had been picking off his troops one by one. That was good. Let Torgar feel the sting of what it meant to be hunted. The war leader raised his hand, signaling for his forces to fan out in search of the intruder. But Jarek was already gone, moving with lightning speed across the jagged landscape. He had no intention of waiting to die. Chapter 4: The Battle for Droska 4. Jarek knew that he couldn't beat Torgar in a straight-up fight. The war leader was too powerful, his forces too numerous. No, he had to outthink him. Outmaneuver him. As the raiders scoured the planet for signs of Jarek's presence, he began to plant the final part of his plan, an ambush in the heart of the Xizor camp. He knew that Torgar would come after him personally. The war leader had too much pride to allow a mere human to defy him. And Jarek was counting on it. It wasn't long before Torgar's personal retinue came crashing into the designated trap. Jarek had set up explosives on the canyon walls, carefully calculated to collapse the rock formations and trap Torgar's soldiers. The ground cracked open, and debris rained down, burying the Xizor in an avalanche of rock. Jarek sprinted into the chaos, moving with ferocity and precision. His blaster cracked, taking down raider after raider, each shot landing with deadly accuracy. But he had a bigger target in mind. Torgar had survived the blast, his massive form emerging from the wreckage, his armor scorched but intact. The war leader's eyes locked onto Jarek, a predatory gleam flashing within them. "You are brave, human," Torgar said, his voice vibrating with menace. "But foolish. You think you can defeat me? I have crushed entire fleets. You are nothing." "I'm the one who's going to end you," Jarek replied, his voice cold and unwavering. And just like that, the final confrontation began. The two warriors collided in a storm of violence. Jarek moved with the speed of a predator, dodging Torgar's strikes and landing blows of his own. But Torgar was a titan, his strength unmatched, his strikes heavy and crushing. Jarek's blaster was useless at close range, so he relied on his training, using his surroundings to his advantage. The fight raged on, and with each passing second, Jarek's chances of survival grew slimmer. He was running out of tricks. Running out of time. Chapter 5: The Deathworlders' Last Gamble. In the heart of the chaos, Jarek spotted something, a weakness. Torgar's movements were powerful but predictable. His arrogance had led him to underestimate Jarek's resourcefulness. Jarek made his move. He dove beneath Torgar's next strike, using his opponent's momentum against him. With one fluid motion, he reached into his pack and activated the final component of his plan, a detonator, connected to the explosive charges set around the raider fleet. The explosion was deafening. Torgar's screams echoed as the entire base erupted in fire and fury. The war leader's body was thrown backward by the blast, his armor failing under the intensity of the explosion. Jarek collapsed to the ground, bloodied and bruised, his body screaming in protest. But he had done it. He had defeated the war leader. Against all odds, against the deadliest raiders in the galaxy, one man had stood and prevailed. The raiders were no more. Chapter 6: The Legacy of the Deathworlder. In the days that followed, news of Jarek's victory spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. The Zizor raiders, once feared and unstoppable, were shattered. And the one who had brought them down was a single human Yarrick Torrin, the Deathworlder. His name became a symbol, a legend. The galaxy learned that no matter how dark the odds, no matter how hopeless the fight seemed, there was always someone who would rise up. Yarrick returned to his humble camp on Droska 4, but the universe would never forget the day when one Deathworlder had defied the galaxy's worst raiders and won. Chapter 7: The Aftermath. The dust from the explosion had barely settled when the first ships arrived. They weren't raider warships, they were representatives from every corner of the galaxy. News of the defeat of Torgar and the destruction of the Zizor raiders had spread like wildfire. Every government, every faction, wanted to know more. The raiders had been a scourge on the galaxy for decades. Now, with their greatest leader vanquished, the threat they posed was seemingly gone. Yarrick sat alone in the ruins of the raider camp. His wounds were deep, but his resolve was unwavering. The victory had cost him dearly, his body battered, bruised, and bloodied. But it had been worth it. The last of the raiders had been wiped out, their warships and their forces scattered and destroyed. A shuttle landed near the wreckage, kicking up a storm of dust. A figure emerged from the craft, an older woman, dressed in the uniform of the Galactic Union. She walked towards him with a deliberate pace, her eyes scanning the battlefield around her. "I never thought I'd see the day when the Zizor were brought to their knees," she said as she approached, her voice calm and authoritative. Yarrick didn't respond immediately. He was still processing everything that had just transpired. The galaxy was in shock, but it was also a time for healing. The raiders, once the most feared faction in the galaxy, had been brought down by one human. "I'm Major Selena Varos, Galactic Union Peacekeeping Division," the woman continued, offering him a nod. "I've been sent to assess the situation. We need to secure the area, and I've been authorized to offer you assistance." Yarrick shook his head, barely acknowledging her presence. "I didn't do this for you. Or for anyone else," he muttered, the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. "I did it because they needed to be stopped." "Understood," she said, her expression softening. "But your actions have changed everything. The Zizor were a problem that spanned many star systems. With their leadership gone, there will be chaos, and we'll need someone to help stabilize that." Yarrick clenched his fists. "You think I'm going to help you, don't you?" Selena didn't flinch. "You don't have to, Yarrick. But I'd be lying if I said we weren't going to need someone with your experience. Someone who can handle the chaos that's coming." Yarrick stood up, still swaying slightly from the exhaustion. "I'm done with fighting. I've lost enough already." Selena's eyes searched his face, understanding the weight of his words. "Then let us help you heal. You can't carry this burden alone." But Yarrick didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the horizon, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. He had taken down the raiders, but there were still many unknowns ahead. Chapter 8: A Galaxy in Shambles. Yarrick didn't stay long with Selena and her team. They offered him medical aid, but he refused most of it. His body needed time, but his mind needed more. The war with the Zizor might be over, but their destruction had left a vacuum that threatened to consume the galaxy. The Galactic Union had called for an emergency summit in the wake of the raiders' fall. Political leaders, military strategists, and diplomats were all scrambling to determine what the new galaxy would look like. The Zizor had been a unifying enemy, and without them, alliances began to fray. Some factions saw the fall of the raiders as an opportunity to seize power, while others feared that the galaxy would descend into a new era of lawlessness. Yarrick, though reluctant to get involved, knew deep down that he could not simply walk away from this. His victory over the Zizor had made him a symbol of resistance, but now he had to decide what kind of legacy he would leave behind. As he boarded a transport ship bound for the Galactic Union's capital, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the war was just beginning. Chapter 9: The Council of Factions. The summit was being held in the heart of the Galactic Union's capital, a sprawling city built into the shell of an ancient asteroid. The council chambers were massive, an amphitheater that was meant to represent the collective power of the galaxy's many factions. Species from all across the stars gathered here, from the towering, insectoid Zrkal to the sleek, enigmatic Kinkari. Yarrick entered the chamber with Selena at his side, a familiar weight pressing on his shoulders. He had been asked to sit as a witness, a symbol of the victory that had brought them to this moment. The room grew silent as Yarrick took his seat. The debate was already in full swing, and it didn't take long for the gravity of the situation to set in. "You can't be serious," barked High Counselor Jowler, a blue-skinned diplomat from the Stricken Dominion. "The Zizor are gone, but the galaxy is not going to be healed just because some human got lucky." "We are facing the aftermath of a centuries-long war," responded Counselor Tyrannis, an older female from the Voltar system. "And now that they are gone, we must rebuild. We need to ensure that we can prevent another war from arising in their place." "The people will rise up if they see weakness," warned another delegate, a young Kinkari named Kesh. "The power vacuum could send the galaxy into a spiral. The Zizor held everything together by fear. We have nothing to replace that." Jarrek's jaw tightened. The room was filled with political maneuvering, and the words of these leaders only seemed to add to the tension. He wasn't here to debate political ideals, he was here because they had asked him to. But more and more, he realized that this wasn't a political crisis, it was a galactic one. "I'll tell you one thing," Yarrick finally said, standing up and silencing the room. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through more than he could ever explain. "The Zizor may have been defeated, but there's something worse coming. And if you don't act now, it won't matter how many treaties you sign or how many armies you mobilize." The council members turned their attention to him. Yarrick had their full attention now. The real enemy isn't just the Raiders. It's the people who think they can fill the void the Raiders left behind. The galaxy's wounds are deep, and if you don't come together, you'll fracture into pieces even worse than before. The Zizor were just a symptom of a larger problem, one that won't go away with their death. The room was silent. He had said what needed to be said, but there was no easy solution. Chapter 10: The Rise of the Deathworlder. The summit lasted for weeks. Discussions were held behind closed doors. Deals were made. But as the days passed, Yarrick found himself drawn into the heart of the political storm. He had no desire for power, but his reputation had already become a rallying point for those who believed in his vision for a united galaxy. The factions began to coalesce around Yarrick, with many seeing him as the figurehead they needed to restore order. They weren't looking for a leader in the traditional sense, but for someone who had the strength to unite them against a common threat. Yarrick, for his part, didn't feel like a leader. He was still just a survivor of a broken world, someone who had fought because there had been no choice. But the galaxy had changed, and Yarrick realized that in order to truly stop the chaos, he couldn't remain a bystander. He had already taken on the Zizor. Now, it seemed, he would have to take on the entire galaxy. Chapter 11: Unlikely Alliances. Jarrek's first move was to form an alliance with the most unlikely group, the Kinkari. Despite their cold and secretive nature, the Kinkari had been quietly working behind the scenes to maintain peace. Their technologies and diplomatic reach gave them significant power, but they had always worked from the shadows, never directly involved in galactic politics. Under Jarrek's guidance, the Kinkari began to move more openly, building alliances with the Stricken Dominion, the Voltar system, and even some factions that had once been enemies of the Galactic Union. As Yarrick worked to unite the factions, he began to see the true scope of the problem. The galaxy was too fragmented. There were too many factions, each with their own agenda, their own sense of power. And unless they could overcome their differences, the galaxy would continue to descend into chaos. Chapter 12: The Dark Horizon. Yarrick stood in the heart of the Kinkari capital, the towering spires and crystalline structures reflecting the pale light of the twin moons. It had been weeks since the summit, and although the initial talks had been promising, the reality was far more complicated. The galaxy's factions were too divided, too entrenched in their own interests, to forge lasting unity. He stood on a balcony overlooking the city, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had come to the Kinkari homeworld hoping to find some semblance of peace, but instead, he found himself embroiled in an even deeper web of politics. The Kinkari, though powerful, were no less ruthless than the raiders they had once feared. They played their own game, a game of information and influence, and Yarrick had become a pawn in their grand design. "You're troubled," came a voice from behind him. Yarrick didn't need to turn to know it was Selena. "More like burdened," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. "The peace we fought for feels like it's slipping through my fingers." Selena stepped up beside him, her gaze sweeping across the cityscape. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy. These factions have been at odds for centuries. They're not going to just suddenly work together because of one victory." Yarrick sighed. "I know. But there's something else. Something darker. I've been hearing whispers of a new faction rising, one even more dangerous than the Zizor." Selena raised an eyebrow. "More dangerous than the Raiders? What do you mean?" "I've heard rumors of a group known as the Nihilists," Yarrick said, his tone grim. "They're not just raiders or warlords. There's something else entirely. A group with no allegiance, no identity, just destruction. And they've been gaining ground since the Zizor fell." A silence fell between them as Selena processed his words. Finally, she spoke. "We can't let another warlord group rise. Not after everything we've already lost." Yarrick nodded, his mind already racing. He had to act. The galaxy was on the brink, and he couldn't afford to let a new threat emerge. Chapter 13: The Nihilist's Shadow. Over the next few weeks, Yarrick and Selena worked tirelessly to track down any information they could about the Nihilists. Their existence was like a ghost story. Everyone had heard of them, but no one had ever seen them. There were no records of their origin, no known leaders. Just a trail of destruction and fear that followed wherever they went. Yarrick had always been able to track down his enemies, but this new threat was unlike anything he had encountered before. The Nihilists didn't rely on brute force like the Zizor or cunning like the Kinkari. They relied on chaos, terror, and an ideology that could not be understood. Through their investigation, they learned that the Nihilists had begun targeting key systems, those that were already struggling to rebuild after the fall of the Zizor. These systems, isolated and vulnerable, had become perfect targets for a group like the Nihilists, who thrived on exploiting weaknesses. Yarrick's contacts were telling him that entire colonies had vanished, wiped from existence without a trace. No ransom demands, no signs of battle. Just gone. "It's like they never existed," Selena said one evening as they analyzed the reports. "Their tactics are unlike anything we've seen. It's as if they're erasing people, not conquering them." Yarrick clenched his fists. "They want to break the galaxy, make it forget who it is. They're using fear as their weapon, leaving no trace of their existence except the panic they leave behind." "How do we fight that?" Yarrick shook his head. "I don't know yet. But we have to find them before they reach the heart of the galaxy." Chapter 14: Into the Abyss. With the Nihilists growing bolder, Yarrick knew he couldn't wait for the galaxy to come to him. He would have to confront this threat head-on, and to do that, he needed to take the fight directly to them. He and Selena gathered a small team, including a few trusted Kinkari operatives and mercenaries, and set out to infiltrate one of the Nihilists' last known bases, an abandoned station in the fringes of space, far from any known trade routes. This was where the rumors had said the Nihilists were organizing, using the vast, empty stretches of space as a cover for their activities. The journey was perilous, with asteroid fields and hostile forces lurking in the shadows. But Yarrick had survived worse, and Selena's steady leadership kept their small crew focused. They arrived at the station just as a strange transmission was intercepted, an encrypted signal that seemed to emanate from deep within the station's core. As they approached, Yarrick could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. This was the first time he'd be stepping into the heart of the Nihilists' operation, and he had no idea what to expect. The station was eerily quiet, almost abandoned in appearance. But something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he sensed a deep, pervasive darkness surrounding the place. "It's too quiet," Selena said, her voice low as she scanned the surroundings. "Keep your guard up." They moved cautiously through the derelict corridors, their footsteps echoing off the cold metal walls. As they reached the center of the station, they found the source of the strange transmission, a large, imposing device embedded into the station's core, glowing with an unnatural light. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a distorted voice filled the air, sending chills down Jarek's spine. "We are the Nihilists. We are the end of all things. You will not survive." The voice wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of their existence, their ideology. The Nihilists didn't want power. They didn't want control. They wanted to erase everything, to leave only a void in their wake. "We've found them," Jarek muttered, his grip tightening around his weapon. "But I don't think they're interested in negotiating." Chapter 15, The Siege of Despair. Before they could react, the Nihilists launched a devastating counterattack. The station's hidden defenses activated, and automated drones filled the corridors. They were unlike anything Jarek had seen before, swift, relentless, and efficient. The battle was brutal. The Nihilists fought like they had no fear of death, throwing themselves into combat with a fanatical fervor. Their weapons were strange, twisted, and crude, but they carried an unsettling efficiency. The chaos they sowed was not just physical, it was psychological, wearing down their enemy's resolve. Jarek and his team fought back with everything they had, but the Nihilists' relentless onslaught wore them down. Jarek had fought many enemies, but these were unlike anything he had encountered. They didn't care about victory in the traditional sense. They cared only about destruction. They cared only about breaking the spirits of those who fought against them. The station's core began to destabilize as Jarek's team fought their way toward the heart of the Nihilists' operation. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to choke the air, each step taking them deeper into a nightmare. But Jarek wouldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. As they reached the heart of the station, Jarek encountered the leader of the Nihilists, a figure shrouded in darkness, their face hidden behind a mask that distorted their voice. "You think you can stop us?" the Nihilist leader asked, their voice cold and dispassionate. "We are the end of all things. We will burn this galaxy down until only ashes remain." Jarek didn't flinch. "You won't break this galaxy. Not while I'm still standing." With a final, desperate charge, Jarek and Selena's team launched their attack, determined to bring an end to the Nihilists' reign of terror. Chapter 16, The Nihilist Reign. The battle for the Nihilist station had been a brutal one. Jarek's team had fought their way to the heart of the base, the atmosphere thick with tension, and the core of the station ready to collapse under the pressure of their assault. But even as the station itself groaned and shuddered, the true nature of the Nihilists began to reveal itself. The Nihilist leader stood before him, cloaked in darkness, the mask twisted and angular, a grotesque representation of what the galaxy had become in the wake of the Raiders' fall. Jarek stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his weapon, his body tense with the weight of the decision ahead. The Nihilist leader was no longer simply a foe, they were an embodiment of the very nihilism that threatened to tear apart the galaxy. "You think you can stop us?" the Nihilist leader asked again, their voice cold, like the echo of death itself. "You've won nothing. You're only delaying the inevitable. The galaxy will crumble, and all of you with it." "You're wrong," Jarek said, his voice firm. "The galaxy will not end because of fear or destruction. It will stand because people like me will fight to keep it that way." Without warning, the Nihilist leader removed their mask, revealing a face twisted by time and suffering, their eyes wild, haunted by the very void they sought to embrace. Their skin was pale, sickly, and their movements were erratic. "We are nothing but the void," they hissed. "And we will consume everything." Before Jarek could react, the Nihilist leader raised their hand, and the station trembled. A violent pulse of energy erupted from the heart of the station, destabilizing everything around them. It was as if the very fabric of space and time was being torn apart. "Get to the core," Yarrick shouted to Selena and the rest of the team. We need to stop the collapse now. With the station on the verge of complete destruction, the nihilist leader laughed a hollow, terrifying sound. You're too late. The end is here. Nothing can save you from the void. But Yarrick wouldn't let that happen. Not again. He had lost too much already. He and Selena fought their way to the control room where the nihilist technology was stabilizing the core. The timer on the system was counting down. They were running out of time. Chapter 17, The Void Unleashed. As Yarrick and Selena reached the control room, the reality of the situation hit them like a freight train. The nihilists were not just after destruction, they were after erasure. They had built a device capable of wiping entire systems from existence, turning star systems into nothing but void. The technology was beyond anything Yarrick had ever seen. It was a weapon that bent the very laws of physics, channeling dark energy to erase entire realities. We can't let them use this, Selena said, her voice strained as she examined the system. This is worse than anything the Zizor ever dreamed of. Yarrick nodded. We have to destroy it, now. They worked together to access the control terminal, but the nihilists had anticipated this. An army of drones, each more vicious than the last, poured into the room, surrounding them. The drones had been programmed to destroy anything that posed a threat to the nihilists' mission, and Yarrick and Selena were top of the list. As the drones closed in, Yarrick and Selena fought back with everything they had. Their weapons blazed, cutting through the metallic figures, but for each drone they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. It was a desperate battle, but Yarrick could feel the shift inside him. He had fought too many enemies like this, too many forces that sought to destroy. This time, he wasn't fighting for survival. This time, he was fighting to save everything. But the countdown continued. Selena, we have no time. Yarrick yelled over the battle. We need to disable the core, now. Selena's fingers flew across the control panel. Her eyes flickered with determination. If I reroute the core's energy, I can trigger a meltdown. But it'll take the entire station with it. Yarrick didn't hesitate. Do it. She didn't waste a second. With a final keystroke, she rerouted the core's energy, initiating a chain reaction that would destabilize the entire station. They had mere moments to escape. Chapter 18, The Escape. The countdown echoed in Yarrick's ears as he and Selena sprinted down the corridors, dodging fire from the remaining nihilist drones. The station trembled with each passing second, the walls shaking violently as the chain reaction began to take hold. The nihilist station, once a bastion of fear and destruction, was now on the verge of total annihilation. Yarrick's heart raced as they reached the hangar bay, where their shuttle was waiting. The final blast doors were closing, and they could hear the explosions growing louder behind them. They ran faster, adrenaline pumping through their veins, pushing their exhausted bodies beyond their limits. They reached the shuttle, and with a final surge of energy, they launched it into the cold void of space just as the station erupted behind them. The shockwave rattled the ship, and the remnants of the station's dark energy rippled across the stars, a blinding flash of light in the distance. Yarrick stared out at the devastation, the realization of what they had just stopped sinking in. The nihilists were gone, but the price of their destruction was steep. We did it, Selena said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. Yarrick didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the distant stars, a thousand thoughts racing through his mind. The galaxy had been saved for now, but the scars of war would never fade. The nihilists were gone, but their ideology, the void they represented, was far from eradicated. We've won, Yarrick finally said, his voice heavy. But we've only just begun. There's more to do. Selena nodded. And we'll be there, fighting. Every step of the way. Chapter 19, The Shattered Galaxy. Yarrick and Selena returned to the Galactic Union, their victory over the nihilists a turning point for the galaxy. The fear that had gripped the galaxy began to ease, but the scars of the battle remained. Entire systems had been lost, colonies erased from existence. The galaxy was healing, but it was also broken, fractured in ways that could not be undone. Jarek's role in the conflict had turned him into something of a symbol, a hero, a leader, but also a reminder of the galaxy's dark history. He had fought to stop the Nihilists, but in the process, he had become a part of the galaxy's story in ways he never anticipated. "I never wanted to be a leader," Jarek said one evening, sitting across from Selena as they watched the stars together. "You don't have to be," Selena replied. "You're already something more. You've shown the galaxy that even in the darkest times, there's hope." Jarek didn't respond right away. He had never asked for the galaxy's adoration. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to survive. But in doing so, he had become something greater than himself. "Then I'll keep fighting," he said, his voice resolute. "Not for power, not for glory, but for the people. The ones who still believed in the future." Chapter 20: The Legacy of the Deathworlder. Years passed since the fall of the Nihilists. The galaxy, though scarred and fragmented, had begun the slow and painful process of rebuilding. Jarek, once a solitary fighter, now stood at the helm of a new coalition, one built not on the remnants of old empires, but on the hope of a better future for all sentient beings. The Galactic Union, though still fractured in many ways, had formed a fragile alliance under Jarek's leadership. The last few years had seen peace return to many war-torn systems. But peace, like everything else, was a fleeting illusion. Jarek sat at his desk in the Grand Council Hall, his mind weighed down by the responsibilities of leadership. He had saved the galaxy from the Nihilists, but that victory had come at a cost. The galaxy was no longer a place of simple alliances and enemies. It was a place of fractured histories, competing interests, and people who had learned to fear what they could not control. His communicator buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen flickered to life, showing Selena's familiar face. "Jarek, we need to talk." Selena's voice was serious, urgent. He straightened, his concern rising. "What is it?" "It's the Vakrans. They've massed on the outskirts of the sector. Their fleets are bigger than we anticipated. We think they're planning something." Jarek's heart sank. The Vakrans, a once peaceful species now turned aggressive in the wake of the Zizor's downfall, had been a growing concern for years. They had lost everything to the Raiders, and now they had turned their sights on the weakened systems of the galaxy. "I'll be there in an hour," Jarek replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. He had fought so long for peace, and yet the galaxy seemed to be on the verge of tearing itself apart again. How much more could he sacrifice before he lost himself entirely? Chapter 21: The Edge of War. The Vakran threat was real. Jarek and Selena joined the council as the galaxy's leaders convened, preparing for the possibility of another war, this time with the Vakrans, who now held the power to crush entire systems. Their military had been rebuilt from the ashes of their homeworld, and they had become a force to be reckoned with. "We cannot allow them to conquer any more systems," Jarek said, standing before the assembly. "We must strike them before they can mobilize further." "But how can we stop them?" one of the council members asked, their voice trembling. "They are as ruthless as the Zizor and their fleets." "I know," Jarek cut them off. "But I'm not asking for a war. I'm asking for a way to stop them before they destroy everything we've built." Selena stepped forward. "We've been trying to negotiate with them, but they won't listen. They've become consumed by the desire for vengeance." Jarek's gaze turned inward for a moment, reflecting on the years he had spent trying to bring peace to the galaxy. "Perhaps we don't need to fight them on their terms," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Perhaps we need to show them that we're not afraid." Chapter 22: The Final Confrontation. The decision was made. The Galactic Union would make a stand against the Vakrans, but it would not be a conventional battle. Jarek knew that the Vakrans were driven by an all-consuming rage, and their desire to dominate could not be defeated by force alone. Instead, Jarek took it upon himself to go directly to the Vakran leaders. He boarded a shuttle, accompanied only by Selena and a small security team. The galaxy's leadership was divided. Some believed in negotiation, others in swift military action. But Yarrick knew what needed to be done. The galaxy would be his to protect, but he had to make one final sacrifice. As they approached the Vagrant fleet, Yarrick's mind raced. Could he convince them to stop their warpath? Could he show them that vengeance would not bring back what they had lost? Or would he, like so many before him, fail to protect the very thing he fought for? The shuttle docked at the Vagrant flagship, a massive vessel gleaming in the vastness of space. The Vagrants, unlike the Nihilists, were not faceless marauders. They had a cause, a painful, destructive cause that had pushed them to the brink of annihilation. Yarrick was their last chance for redemption. Inside the flagship's command center, Yarrick was escorted to the Vagrant leader, a tall, imposing figure draped in black armor. Yarrick of the Deathworlders, the Vagrant leader said, their voice cold and commanding. You come here with nothing but words. Do you think that words can stop the fire that burns in our hearts? Yarrick met their gaze, unwavering. No, he said quietly. But I think we can build something better than fire. We can rebuild what was lost. The Vagrant leader's eyes flickered with something uncertainty, maybe even fear. What do you offer, then? We have nothing left to lose. Yarrick stepped forward. I offer you peace. I offer you a chance to rebuild your worlds, not through vengeance, but through cooperation. You don't have to be a destroyer. There's a future beyond the pain if we're willing to reach for it. For a moment, there was silence. Then the Vagrant leader spoke again, softer this time. You cannot understand. We have seen everything taken from us. My people have lost more than you could ever know. I know what it's like to lose, Yarrick said, his voice thick with emotion. I've lost more than I can count. But fighting won't bring it back. You have a chance to lead your people forward. Don't let your rage destroy the very thing you seek to rebuild. The tension in the room was palpable, but something shifted in the Vagrant leader's eyes. For the first time, Yarrick saw the weight of their burden, of their people's pain, and in that moment, he knew that it wasn't victory they sought, but an end to the cycle of suffering. Perhaps you are right, the Vagrant leader said, their voice a whisper. Perhaps there is a way forward. Chapter 23, The Dawn of a New Era. In the days that followed, Yarrick's words rippled across the galaxy. The Vagrants agreed to cease their expansion, to join the Galactic Union not as conquerors, but as partners in rebuilding a fractured galaxy. There were still those who opposed the idea, those who saw the Vagrants as nothing more than a threat. But the majority rallied behind Yarrick's vision for a galaxy built on cooperation, not fear. The final battle was not one of bloodshed, but one of understanding, a battle won not by weapons, but by conviction. Yarrick had not only saved the galaxy, he had begun the difficult task of healing it. As the sun rose over the newly united worlds, Yarrick stood on the balcony of his quarters, looking out at the stars. He had fought for peace, for justice, and for those who could not fight for themselves. The galaxy was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like there was hope. Selena joined him, her presence a steadying force in the storm of his thoughts. We did it, she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Yarrick turned to her, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Yes. But this is just the beginning. The galaxy was not yet healed. But Yarrick knew that as long as there were people willing to fight for a better future, there was hope.